Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you another one of my Versus episode. These are sometimes triggered by the feedback that I get from you as those that are the regular viewers of this channel. And so you ask questions about, how does this lens compare to this particular lens? And if I get enough of those questions, I sometimes feel like there is an episode like this that is warranted, even if these aren't necessarily what you would consider natural head-to-head competitors. In this case, I'm talking about the very inexpensive, very compact, but a full-frame prime lens, and that is the Samyang Autofocus 45mm F1.8. It's a lens that I recently did a long-term review of, and a lens that I find quite special, particularly when you consider it's a lens that easily fits in the palm of your hand. Now, another competitor that has more recently come to market at the beginning of this year was the new Samyang Autofocus 50mm F1.4 Mark II. And while obviously we're talking about two very different types of lenses in terms of their size and their class, and maybe even those that they might typically compete with, these lenses, because neither of them is radically expensive, are lenses that you could potentially be cross-shopping and considering. And obviously there are many of you who have considered just that and are wondering if maybe you could get by with something like the 45mm as opposed to going to the larger and heavier 50mm lens. So we're going to break that down in a Versus episode today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the feature set and how they compare. We're going to take a close look at optical comparison because it's more intriguing than what you might think. And then I'll give you my recommendation as to what audience I think should go for the 45mm, which should go for the bigger 50mm f1.4 Mark II.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So first of all, let's talk about that price for a moment, because at the moment, the 45mm, the price is discounted by $100, and so right now you can get it for about $300 US. Which means that it is, the gap between it and the 50mm is a little bit wider than what it has been in the past. The 50mm retails right now for $679 US. Now, as a 50mm f1.4, fairly professional grade lens, that really is a very inexpensive price point. And obviously, the top of the heap lens here would be the Sony 50mm f1.2 G Master, which by the way is an amazing lens if you've got deep pockets, but it is a lens that's going to cost well over $2,000. And so as a byproduct, there is a big gap between a lens like that. And so it is actually more closely aligned with the small 45mm in terms of price. Now, obviously also they do not have the exact same focal length. 45mm is a little bit shyer than 50mm, though as we're going to see in some of our framing test, it's not a radical difference, and so that may not be a deal breaker. I actually find the 45mm focal length to be quite an enjoyable one for a lot of different applications, and it's not radically different enough from 50mm to where you completely lose the compression, but that extra little bit of width sometimes can be useful. They also have different maximum apertures, with the smaller lens having an f1.8 maximum aperture, the f1.4 lens having obviously the larger f1.4 aperture. And that does play out in a very real way that we're going to see in just a moment when it comes to optical performance, outside the fact of being able to gather in about 2/3 of a stop more light than what the f1.8 lens does. So that might be a consideration for you. Now, obviously, a strong reason to consider the 45mm lens is going to be when it comes to the size of the lens. This is a truly compact lens. It's a part of what Samyang calls their tiny series, and it really is a very tiny lens. It is, I think really kind of the definition of a plastic fantastic, in that while it's not a throwaway build quality, it has a very plasticky type build quality. It only weighs 162 grams, 5.71 ounces, very, very lightweight. It is only right under 62 millimeters in diameter, giving it a tiny 49 millimeter front filter thread and only 56 millimeters in length. And so it is very compact, very small, and obviously very inexpensive. It also is basically featureless in terms of it has a focus ring, and that's it. There is no weather sealing, there are no switches on the barrel. It does come with a lens hood and a little compact case, but you are basically paying for the optics and the autofocus inside. You're not paying for anything, significant in terms of the actual build quality here. And I will note that I've been using this lens for over 3 years. It has been dropped, unfortunately, but it is held up well, and it has stayed centered. It still works perfectly well, and there's really no visible marking on it. So while it is an inexpensive build, it has held up reasonably well. Now, the newer 50mm F1.4 finds Samyang in a kind of renaissance where they are really expanding the feature list of their lenses and making them more competitive with some, bigger brand options out there. And so we'll see that in just a moment. But what we have got here as far as the raw specs is that this is a lens that is still pretty lightweight, particularly for a 50mm F1.4 lens. It only weighs 420 grams, and yeah, that's a lot more than 162 grams, but it's still very lightweight. It's unlikely that many people would have a big issue with carrying it as far as the weight, but it does obviously occupy a larger footprint. It is 80 millimeters in diameter, leaving a 72 millimeter front filter thread, and it is right at about 89 millimeters in overall length. And so yes, as you can see, there is a radical difference in the overall size of the two lenses. Now, one advantage that it does have relative to the 45mm is that it can focus down more closely, down to 40 centimeters versus 45 centimeters, and it has a higher 0.16 times magnification versus 0.12 times. So that gives you a little bit more flexibility of how close you can get and the type of images you can produce in that kind of setting. And as noted, it does have a much greater host of features. Number one, it is fully weather sealed. It's got at least 6 different seal points inside, starting with the gasket, all the way to the front element, at the switches, at the ring here. It has a focus hold button, which obviously can be programmed to different purposes, just like Sony lenses. And it has a custom switch, something that is unique to Samyang right now. And you do have to have the lens station to change the, program different functions into it. But you have the option, as I have it set up right now, that if I am in the correct mode, M2, that the ring will function as an aperture ring. And so you can use that for aperture control if you prefer that. And then if I switch into M1, it automatically will shift into manual focus. And so it also kind of functions as an AF/MF switch depending on how you use it there. And so obviously that expands some usability. I also note that when it comes to that ring, this is a much higher level ring in terms of the damping and the feel, and thus the manual focus action is much nicer when it comes to that.
Now, while both lenses sport a linear stepping motor, you can see that the 45mm is the snappier of the two when it comes to standard focus adjustments. The 50mm has to push larger elements, larger glass with that stepping motor, and as a byproduct of that, you can see that it's a little bit more leisurely in focus changes.
Now, as noted, the 45mm does have the faster focus of the two, but it's not like a radical night and day difference, and both of them, focus fast enough in my experience for most applications. I wouldn't want to try to track action with the 50mm necessarily. I have done a bit of tracking of the action with the 45mm, and it did just fine. But, you kind of need to choose according to your application, and if your application is, you need a 50mm lens, it's also going to do high-speed work, probably the G Master is going to be your choice with those quad linear motors, which make a radical difference in terms of focus speed. But if your needs are more ordinary, then I think that either one of these lenses is going to get the job done. How about the optics? It's a very interesting comparison that although they're radically different lenses, there are some strengths and weaknesses unique to both of them. Let's dive in, let's take a look.
So throughout these comparisons, we'll have the 45 millimeters on the left and the 50 millimeter on the right. So taking a look at the vignette and distortion, what we can see is that there is a mild amount of barrel distortion on the 45 millimeters, a mild amount of pincushion distortion on the 50 millimeter. So taking a quick look at corrections, we can see that it's just a +1 to correct for the distortion, about a +59 to correct for the vignette. On the 50 millimeter, we needed a tiny bit more correction, a -3 to correct for the pincushion distortion, and about an equal amount of vignette correction. And so not a huge difference between the two in that regard. So let's take a look at how they hold up in terms of resolution. This is on the 50 megapixel alpha 1 sensor, and this is at 200% magnification. So in the center of the frame, we can see that both are very sharp, though you can see that even at f1.4 in the center, there is just slightly more sharpness in contrast for the 50 millimeter lens. If we look here at the mid frame, however, we can see that the sweet spot is larger on the 45 millimeter, as it looks crisper there. And if we look down into the corner, we can see that while the 50 millimeter delivers a brighter corner, the resolution and contrast is actually better on the 45 millimeter. If we take a look at both of them at f2, it's a similar story where the 50 millimeter is sharper in the center of the frame. Looking at the mid frame, there's still an advantage for the 45 millimeter, and into the corner, we can see that it also continues to have an advantage in terms of sharpness and contrast, though it's not quite as bright in the corners. Now at f2.8, both lenses are fantastically sharp in the center of the frame, though again, a mild advantage to the 50 millimeter lens. In the mid frame, the advantage is less obvious for the 45 millimeters, but still exists. Moving down into the corner, now I would say that the 50 millimeter is very close to catching up, though right out at the edge, the 45 millimeter is still the sharper lens. We'll take a quick look at how both of them do as far as centering. We can see that the 50 millimeter is looking a little bit better on this side, up into this corner. Again, it's the 45 millimeter that looks a little bit sharper in the extreme corner and up in the upper left corner. Once again, it is the 45 millimeter that is ever so slightly better. Stop on down to f5.6. As is the case with many modern lenses, you're going to be hard-pressed to tell them apart as far as performance. Both of them are very, very good at here at the f5.6, and you can see that as we look at various places, they're just both extremely crisp, very high detail. There's really nothing to complain about in terms of sharpness and contrast when you stop the lenses down. Now, if you compare at minimum focus distance, both of them focus down fairly close, with the 45 millimeter focusing down to appropriately 45 centimeters. The 50 millimeter actually focuses down as close as 40 centimeters, which gives it the higher degree of magnification. It's 0.16 versus 0.12 times. They do kind of flip positions a little bit, though, in terms of the detail. You can see that the 45 millimeter gives us a flatter plane of focus and a little bit better contrast, whereas the 50 millimeter is a little bit more center focus, so a little bit less flat plane of focus. So you do have to be a little bit careful where you focus, because you will lose contrast kind of based on that. Now, I think that both of these lenses actually have really special rendering. However, the advantage of the 50 millimeter with the larger maximum aperture and slightly longer focal distance is going to be seen in the bokeh department. Now, interestingly, at this focus distance and in this particular test, I felt like the 45 millimeter had more pop on the subject. You can see better contrast and rendering of the three-dimensional subject. You can see that both of them have a minor amount of fringing, but nothing that is overly destructive. But if you look at zones like this, you can see that there is some slight busyness, though it's still rendered quite softly, whereas the 50 millimeter is just, made that completely creamy. You can also see that the 50 millimeter does better in terms of the geometry, and the bokeh circles are more lemon-shaped on the 45 millimeter towards the edge of the frame, even though I give it the edge in terms of its overall, sharpness and contrast on a three-dimensional subject like this. But when it comes to bokeh, the 50 millimeter is the easy winner. Now, what's interesting is that advantage remains even if you stop both lenses down to the same aperture of f1.8. And so you can see here that it's still softer in rendering, the 50 millimeter. It still has definite advantage in circular shape, with an even more circular shape, and the bokeh highlights are still bigger and softer in general. Now, what's also interesting is that the 45mm, it retains a very slight advantage, though the 50mm is closer here in terms of the overall sharpness and contrast. But if we look at, the various things that are in focus here, I still favor the 45mm for its actual sharpness and rendering, but the 50mm is the winner when it comes to bokeh. Let's give this another case in point here. And so here we have the 45mm on the left and the 50mm on the right. So if you look at the bokeh, for one thing, in this zone where you have an ever slight bit of busyness, it's completely creamy on the 50mm. Also here where there's a little bit of outlining of the flowers, they're nice and soft on the 50mm. And as you look towards the bokeh highlights, they really favor the 50mm. They're just obviously bigger, rounder, softer, all of those things. Once again, however, when it comes to looking at the actual subject, I do favor the 45mm for being a little bit sharper with a little bit higher contrast. Now, as we saw before, the advantage of the sharpness and contrast remains with the 45mm, even if you're using an equal aperture, though its advantage is not as significant. But as before, we can see that the bokeh remains softer and less busy on the 50mm, with a really, really great out-of-focus rendering of bokeh highlights, and then just kind of general softness of the scene. And even in this zone here, where you do have some hard edges that kind of catch your eye a little bit, with a 45mm on the 50mm, they are really, really nice and smooth. Now, both lenses will show slight flare artifacts, either wide open, and the nature of it changes a little bit when stopped down, with a little more inconsistency where you can see that flashing and a little bit stronger ghosting artifacts. Nothing deal breaking there on the 50mm. On the 45mm, you can see that wide open, I would say it's a little bit less flare prone compared to the 50mm. When you stop the 45mm down, it also will show a little more of those flashes, along with some ghosting artifacts that are roughly similar to what we see on the 50mm. No real advantage for either one.
And so, as you can see, the optical comparison is maybe a little more nuanced and complex than what you might expect. But both of these lenses do deliver really great looking images, and they certainly have very strong strengths relative to other competitors on the market. And for that reason, I think that they certainly bring value to the table. So, who should buy which one? Obviously, I think the 45mm is a great choice. If you're on a tight budget and you really don't have a lot to spend, go for the 45mm. It really is a blast to use. I love the images that come off of it, and it is so compact and lightweight that, a secondary person is someone that really needs to travel light, and you can throw this lens into your bag, as I have done many times when traveling, and just pull it out when needed, and have maybe a faster maximum aperture to complement maybe a slower, super zoom or something like that. And it really is a blast to use. It's a great walk around street type lens, or even a sightseeing lens, because it does have a flexible focal length, and it's a lot of fun. If you are someone who is more about bokeh, maybe about portraits, because when it comes to portrait work, maybe, even though I think that the 45mm is ever so slightly sharper in some places at very wide apertures, as we saw, when you're composing near the center of the frame, the 50mm is very, very sharp. But on top of that, it has really incredible bokeh rendering that is really soft, really smooth. And so in some cases, when you're shooting portraits, it's maybe less about getting every pore on a person's face and more about the general look of images. And I do think that the 50mm really excels in that aspect. And so if you're looking more for a general purpose lens around this focal length, and you think f1.8 is fast enough for you, and frankly it probably is, then check out the 45mm. It is a great, great value. If you want something more for portraiture and you want the bigger maximum aperture, the 50mm f1.4 Mark II, the Mark II is much better than the Mark I, so make sure you get that right. But the Mark II is really a lovely portrait lens and a great 50mm f1.4 lens if that's what you're looking for. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, there are links there to both of these full reviews, and of course I have full video series on both of them as well. There's also image galleries from both lenses, so you can maybe get a little bit more of a feel for the rendering and the performance from each lens. Buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. This also link is to follow myself or Craig on social media, or to check out our collaborative channel, Let the Light In TV. You can also get channel merchandise if you haven't already. You can become a patron to help support this channel. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.